I think we as a profession either need to put real concerted effort into how do we stay relevant, credible providers of information to most pet parents, or we need to watch the train pull out of the station.
Welcome to Vet Life Reimagined. What happens when a competitive swimmer with a lackluster high school transcript shows up to lead some of the most influential organizations in animal health? In this episode, we sit down with Dr. David Haworth, a veterinarian whose career path looks like a masterclass in the pivot. From a tiny clinical practice to the executive offices of Pfizer, PetSmart Charities, and the Morris Animal Foundation, David has navigated nearly every corner of our industry. He brings a uniquely grounded perspective on what it means to be a healer at scale, balancing the deep individual impact of the clinic with the broad systemic impact of global biotech and philanthropy. What you'll hear in this episode: why David pursued a PhD alongside his DVM, and how learning to ask the right question transformed his approach to leadership. A vulnerable look at the moment David asked himself, what does impact look like to him? Fighting evil, how a 6-pound splenic tumor pivoted his focus to oncology and eventually led to his work with the Golden Retriever Lifetime Study and Genomics diagnostics. And the future of the profession, a candid and perhaps controversial warning about the disintermediation of veterinary medicine and why the profession needs to decide if it wants to remain a central piece of the pet parent universe. Whether you are a student wondering where your career could go, or a seasoned practitioner feeling the shift in the neighborhood of pet care, David's insights offer a powerful roadmap for staying relevant in a rapidly changing world. So let's get to the conversation with Dr. David Haworth. When did you know you were interested in veterinary medicine?
I am so archetypal. When I was a middle child of two professors, the one thing I loved was the idea of helping animals. And, I often say it's not that I don't like humans. I've been married to one for 35 years and I raised two reasonably successfully. But I actually, the choice has always been to be a healer and be a healer of animals. So pretty early on, 4, 5, something, it never really occurred to me to do anything else.
Well, that's interesting because you also told me a little bit about your parents. You said they were professors. I'd love for you to go a little bit deeper because they had some pretty interesting careers and career paths because they also had entrepreneurial businesses and things like that. So do you mind sharing just a little bit about what they did?
I could wax eloquently about my parents for hours. They were amazing people who I've always just so looked up to. I mean, of course, I was a teenager, so I wasn't abnormal. I'm sure I thought that they were boring then, but as I've gotten older, the older I've gotten, the more impressive my parents were. So they were economics professors, started in the late 60s at Florida State University. Sometime in the late 70s with a couple of friends, they were like, this computer thing might become something. And so they started a consulting firm, mostly in statistics. My mother in particular was an econometrics specialist, so the statistics around economics. And they built a company that really impressive under any circumstances. So by the early 2000s, they had 200 employees. They had offices in Washington, D.C. and San Francisco, as well as in Tallahassee, Florida, and about 50 PhDs, all doing consulting work. And so when I think about it, how it impacted me in my career, it was normal in my family. I mean, not only was it normal to pursue higher education, when I was growing up, I don't remember thinking that I would stop at an undergraduate career, which is, when I wax philosophic, I think much of that early childhood impact all the way up to your mid-20s is really learning what normal should look like. And when you grow up in families where graduate degrees are normal, then that's what's normal. And so also with my parents, it was entrepreneurism was just normal. You do it with a safe background. But if you see a need, there's no reason why you shouldn't be the one to help fill that. So yeah, they're pretty special. I could keep going.
No, it's a really good start to Into the World, I think, because it also gives you some empowerment to, take control and see what you can do. in life. So I think that's a good start.
There was
Yeah.
never really any blaming
Right.
other people. The expectation was if you see a problem, there's no reason why it shouldn't be you to go fix it. And, again, it's only when you get a little older do you realize that that's not the philosophy in many households. So it's what's normal for you is not normal for everyone.
And I'm sure that came up many times throughout your life.
Oh, man.
But you did a lot of advanced degree. And I will say also, you did your bachelor's degree at William and Mary, I saw, which my brother would be super jealous. He is a history buff,
Oh,
and that is like his dream school. He even got a t-shirt, and just because he thinks it's cool. So
go Tribe. Joe, funny story about William and Mary. I was a lackluster student in high school, to say the least. It was just, I couldn't find the passion. Classic, when I was interested in something like in biology, it was easy and fun, and I would do well grade wise. If I wasn't, I failed trigonometry twice. Not probably because I couldn't handle it. It was just because it was boring to me and I didn't do the work. And I really had to struggle to get my work ethic going. But I swam. I was a competitive swimmer in Florida. At that time, I was reasonably good for that context. And William and Mary gave me a slot to get in based on my SAT scores and swimming, not on my grades. And so William and Mary took a pretty big gamble on me. And, after a couple of years, I seemed to find my groove and so understood what academic rigor and discipline was for. And so, yeah, William and Mary was a fun, very, as most undergraduates' experiences are, hugely growth. So there are so many names and people there who influenced me strongly, mostly my peers who would say, you can mess around, David, if you want to on Thursday night, but I got to go study. And I'd be like, oh, fine, I'll go study with you.
you found good peers to surround yourself.
And I'm sure I found a lot of bad peers too, but luckily good peers, the good angels on this shoulder seemed to win out on that. But it was a very fun place. One of the funny stories is, we used to run before practice. So there was a 4-mile loop around campus that we would have to run before swim practice. And we would routinely get stopped somewhere in the tourist area of Colonial Williamsburg to take someone's picture. And you're like, why would it occur to you to stop 20 sweating young men who are clearly on doing something else? But, it was Colonial Williamsburg. So.
Well, good. So time-wise of getting your grades up is probably good because getting into vet school, it does require some grades there.
It did.
And so you did a DVM degree, and you also have a PhD in reproductive physiology. I got to read that. So was that all together, or was that kind of spread out?
Yeah. So I mentioned my grades. My grades didn't start to pick up until after a couple of years in undergraduate. So the best thing that happened at William and Mary is that I met a girl, and she got into law school in Colorado. So I followed her, and then I worked odd jobs and took classes at night to get my grade point up. So that was about 2 years gap there, which was, in retrospect, extraordinarily valuable to teach you the value of a 40 or 60-hour work week once you got into vet school. But yeah, I got into Colorado State University. At that time, we had a pretty robust DVM PhD combined program. As far as the reproductive physiology choice to get a PhD in that, one of my professors at the time said, 2 reasons you go into graduate school for a PhD. One is you are just absolutely fascinated by an area and you want to devote your life to thinking about it. The other is to get a scientific fishing license, to learn from the best people at the university how to frame questions, because graduate degrees, in my mind, professional degrees and graduate degrees are subtly but importantly different. In professional degrees, when you start the program, it is a very writ program. You have options, of course, you can have different concentrations, but when you pass those courses and then you pass some kind of national exam to prove that you weren't a fluke in passing those courses, you are that profession. Graduate degrees are different because, to get a PhD, at least at that time, I think the wording was you had to meaningfully advance the field. And so that's a lot more about, there are courses, but it's about how to frame questions and how to really live the scientific method of understanding how to ask a question and then find an answer to that question. And that, more than anything else, has driven, everything from business decisions to leadership choices to everything since has come from that kind of really deep understanding. And I give credit to Gordon Neiswender, who was my advisor for my PhD. He was as old school a scientist as you could get. His whole mantra was, what's the damn question you're trying to answer? And really big guy. There's actually a road named after him now on Colorado State campus. He was a university distinguished professor at the time, and just a difficult, I should say, but incredible mentor and teacher. And I owe him a lot.
It's often the ones who put a little extra pressure on us that we end up maybe not in the moment appreciating, but definitely later on can go back and appreciate.
Yeah, not to fast forward, but when I finished my PhD and I went back to vet school, I kind of thought to myself, gosh, after working as hard as I did for my PhD, it's not patting myself on the shoulder. It was just the way that program was structured. You kind of had to finish a PhD in 3 years. And so that's hard. The average PhD is 4.5 years. And so we really dove into it. And so we all talk about how hard we work and how many hours, but there was a lot of hours put into that program. And when I got back to vet school, junior and senior year didn't feel that daunting. So I actually did a postdoctoral fellowship while I was on those last 2 years of school under a guy named Steve Withrow, who Withrow and McEwen is the clinical oncology text that most of us use. And Steve was famous for being stern, demanding of the people who worked for him. He and I always got along really famously. I credit him for so much of the way I approached veterinary medicine and why I still think cancer is one of the biggest challenges and one of the worthiest enemies that we could have. But he was hard. And I agree. Those are the kinds of coaches, mentors, leaders that you look back on and you think, wow, I grew so much underneath that.
Well, this is a very interesting perspective too, because one of the other questions that I often ask people around this time of their journey is, what did you think that life would be like? What were you kind of aiming when it came to being a veterinarian after vet school? And how did that change throughout vet school? And there's so many influences that you're talking about through this whole process. So what was that for you? Did you start with one and then completely change your mind by the end of it?
Our family has a saying that if you look back and you think to yourself, I honestly made the best decision with the information that I had at the time from the options that were in front of me, then it's not a bad decision. And so when I started the PhD program in reproductive physiology, I will say about halfway through, I started thinking, we figured most of this good stuff out. There's not a lot of unconquered territory in this. Now, of course, there are really good questions to still be asked. And we were just at the cusp of genetic analysis at that time. And that's really where the focus of my PhD was, which genes are being expressed during which parts of the reproductive cycle. But in terms of figuring out how babies are made, we kind of got that, and so then there's the optimization and then figuring out why babies might not be made in a circumstance. And that stopped appealing to me. And then I went back to vet school, kind of curious. And my professor, Gordon Neiswender, who I mentioned, had said to me, well, just finish the vet school thing. It's important, but then we're going to get you back and we'll do a postdoc and then you'll be a professor someplace. And again, having been raised as the child of professors, I thought that's not a bad plan. And then I saw Steve Withrow take out a splenic tumor as a third-year vet student. It was like, hey, there's surgery going on. And I went in and I saw this thing. And I don't want to make it too dramatic, but he pulled out of this, say, 70-pound dog, a 6-pound black, nasty, vascularized tumor on the spleen. And I thought, that's evil. That, I don't know what evil looks like, but that kind of feels to me like that's evil. And I went to talk to Dr. Neiswender and I said to him, I think I have to pivot over to cancer because now's the time, right? You can't establish a long literature path in one branch of physiology and then try to pivot later in your career. And he said, no one's ever going to argue that that's a worthy opponent. And so I started doing that. I wrote 2 grants. There was some really interesting stuff going on. I wrote 2 grants to the NIH. Neither of them got funded. And I thought to myself, I don't think I want to be a veterinarian and never practice veterinary medicine. And so, again, pivot, started interviewing with different practices and ended up going to a practice in Spokane, Washington, 800 square foot practice, 2 doctors sitting between a Chinese restaurant and a dry cleaners. You can't make it up. So archetypal, small animal practice in a small town. And so that was where I went immediately following vet school. But I will say, again, in the pivot, there was a time, and I talk about it a lot when I talk to vet students about career paths. I say it was February in Spokane, Washington, not the most uplifting time or setting. I was sitting in my car about to go into practice, and I was very, probably on borderline depressed at that time. The practice wasn't working out great. The economics, of course, were very challenging for a young person with kids. My kids at that time were 3 and 5 years old. And I did the math and I thought, okay, so let's just ballpark this. If I saw 5,000 new patients every year, which of course is an very few people see 5,000 new patients every year, but make the math easy. And I have a 20-year career. That means I'm going to impact 100,000 animals. Is that a big number or a small number? I ask vet students that because I think it is, again, back to what's normal for you. And is it a big number or a small number? The answer is yes, of course. It is a both big number and a small number. But for me, at that moment, there was a gestalt to say, that's not a big enough number for me. And I'm willing to have a shallower impact on individuals if I can have a broader impact on a bunch of animals. And so that was it. That afternoon, started sending out resumes to biotech companies all through California, the rest of the world. And this is the year 2000. So it was a very weird time in our economy and world, and lightning struck. And I was able to get a position at Pfizer Animal Health, which is, of course, now is Zoetis. And we had 11 really great learning years in that environment. So that was sort of the pinball period of me ending up kind of where I was earlier in my career, but I got to experience just a whole bunch of different academics, small animal practice, and then finally landing in larger organizations.
Well, and still having that small animal clinical experience, you still get it.
Oh,
Like
100%.
you were in it, you get it. So you can carry that forward into those other scenarios that really need that perspective. That perspective is not always there. So it's really good of you to be able to go in with that passion and that insight and that vision of the purpose behind it. And I was thinking about this when you were talking about your PhD work and how important it was to know the question that you're asking. You said something about business too, and I was like, that is good. How to learn like business skills from that, because science and business don't always mesh super well.
Well, I should say scientists and business people oftentimes don't mesh very well. And I think that's just a question of what are we prioritizing? And oftentimes we get this conversation happening in veterinary medicine where veterinarians are not good business people. And I think the issue is that veterinarians are often making decisions based on non-financial priorities. Either it's in the best interest of the animal or it's the best interests of the clinic. And as a result, when I would say more one-dimensional business people look at those decisions, either in prospect or retrospect, then they're saying, oh, that was a bad business decision. And you think, nope, it was a good decision, whether it had financial implications that you wouldn't have chosen. So yes, I think that the real thing, when you're fundamentally asking questions, it's what are you really asking? And that carries through all walks of life.
Yeah. If you could summarize that like a decade of your career, your experience with Pfizer,
Yeah.
like what do you feel like were some of the most impactful things that you learned during that time that you could take to the next step?
Oh, two things. First thing, I found out that I really love getting a group of individuals aligned onto the same path. And oftentimes you go into these things thinking that you're all on the same path, but I think that's the subtle art of leadership is making sure that everyone has articulated and had an opportunity to talk about where they think this path goes, and then having a consensus position, or in absence of consensus, if that's just impossible, then having a very clear autocratic decision of nope, that's the next step that we're going to go. And I always tell people that if they can early in their career, go someplace that is resource rich, like a large organization, because you can do all the things there, the training, the learning and development issues that you really can't get anywhere else. And even if you choose to do something very different when you're in a smaller organization, at least you're doing it from a position of understanding. Oh, okay, so maybe I don't want to pay for the Microsoft suite in my little startup, but I know what that looks like. And so now this is just a variance off of that, which is easier for our brains to deal with, is variations off something that's known as opposed to something completely different, blank slate. So that's one. Number two, I found out that I really like business. The throwaway line is that I love reading the Wall Street Journal as much as I like reading scientific journals. And just because of the dynamic that it allows us to have, business is sort of, it's hunting parties and village life fast forwarded 2000 years. It's how do you get along with people with different priorities, different needs? How do you predict what others, customers, really want? And sometimes you're right, sometimes you're not. Sometimes other things come into play, but those 11 years of great mentors, terrific people. That was also a really amazing time at Pfizer Animal Health. It was a training ground for a whole lot of future leaders in the industry. Now, as I walk down the halls at VMX, I see as many of my old colleagues, and it's always enjoyable. There was very few unenjoyable people there.
Yeah. Well, those are fantastic. And I'm smiling because I'm learning a lot of those lessons too. You had mentioned when you were sitting in your car outside of the clinic and trying to figure out like what's your number when it comes to like impact. As you were getting into a ginormous company like Pfizer, yes, you talked about it's resource rich, which is something I also was intrigued very quickly and was looking for. And those are all great for personal growth and just learning about yourself on top
Yeah.
of like all these other things in life. Um, were you often clear on that impact that you were having since that was kind of the motivation?
No, no. There are so many times. I remember specifically walking down the stairwell in Groton, Connecticut, complaining to my father about like, oh, they don't, I'm not getting appreciated. I'm not getting the good work. Somebody else got this role and I really wanted it. And I remember him just being quiet for a second after I kind of got out of energy. And he goes, yeah, but the paychecks are still clearing, right? I mean, you're still getting paychecks every 2 weeks. And I was like, that's a really good perspective to have. So sometimes it was just a job. No, I didn't. But, I think in retrospect, so for instance, we reformulated a leptospiral vaccine. Yeah, you may not remember, but back in the 90s, lepto, it was widespread zoonotic disease, important disease, but the vaccines were pretty messy and you got a lot of reactivity. So, many practices, it doesn't matter what the adverse events that the pharma company says. If you've had one little white dog have a bad reaction on the way home and had to explain to that owner why it was so important to get that vaccine, you generally don't want to give that vaccine to little white dogs anymore. So we were reformulating and cleaning it. And I happened to be the lead on that team, learned so much about the nuts and bolts of how these things happen, how we get regulated products approved. But most importantly, 3 years into sales, we had sold 40 million vaccines. I was like, okay, I had a little bit of that. And one of the comments that I've heard, and I really agree with, is that it's an area under the curve question. It's hard to be, as a corporate person, it's really hard to be a hero on any given day. If you're an emergency veterinarian, you're a hero. Sometimes you're not a hero, but oftentimes you are a hero to a family, and that's deep impact. When you're in corporate world, your impact is a lot more shallow, but a lot broader. So does anybody know that before they listen to your podcast, does anybody remember that I led that team? Probably not. And did I have very much impact? No, it was a team of, 50, 70 people. But I know that it was a better vaccine, and I had a little bit of nudge into that. And so that was an impact that I did get to see. And I think part of mental health is reminding yourself of the impacts that you really did have, and in a realistic, non-inflationary way. And so, yeah, the short answer to your question was no, probably I didn't see the impact very often. But yes, in retrospect, there was some moments there where we pushed.
Thank you. And you so well explained a little bit of the difference when it comes to impact in a clinical setting versus the broader corporate setting too. So people are, you can kind of see the difference. But I think either one, it's important to stop and reflect and
Sure.
ask yourself those questions, because I think it's very easy to keep going and getting lost and just getting frustrated and then and hopefully you call your father, who reminds you of the reality check and allow you to think about, oh, okay, I got it. Thanks. So
Yeah.
for letting me guide that. And,
Thanks, Dad. I'm
be back.
35. I have 2 doctorate degrees, but I kind of needed that little reminder. Appreciate you, Dad.
No matter how many degrees, we are ultimately still human. So now I'm like thinking back, oh, wait a minute. You said that you had this enemy of cancer. So
Right.
where did that come in? Did that ever come back, or?
It does. It came back. It was always there. So
Okay.
when I was at Pfizer and ideas would come about, I would always be the guy pushing cancer therapies. And, I would still say one of the travesties of life is that we as veterinarians are by and large still using the cancer therapeutics that I was trained on years and years and years ago, decades ago. There's been very little new, and that's contrasted to our friends in the human health profession. There are 250 personalized cancer therapies approved by the FDA, mostly based on genetic testing. And so much later, I had an opportunity to found a genomic diagnostic company, co-found with my friend Will Hendricks, called Vidium Animal Health. And that's where it came back clearly. So relearning about cancer genetics and the fascinating things that we're finding out about cancer genomics was really helpful. I never left it. Also, we got to spend a lot of time at Morris Animal Foundation trying to better understand cancer in our pets. And so including the Golden Retriever Lifetime Study, which really was at its heart a longitudinal study to find the environmental, nutritional, and genetic causes of cancer.
That is interesting. And of course, you put a great poster child for cancer and the Golden Retriever.
I did.
So look at that. Super fascinating, because this is such a huge study. Like, it's still referenced today. We're still leveraging this information. Do you mind sharing a little bit about that story a little bit deeper?
I think it's the reason that I actually got the job of president and CEO at Morris Animal Foundation. So my predecessor there, Patty Olson, amazing human being. This was an idea that was born on a bus at VMX before it was VMX, when it was still NAVC. And for those of you who might not remember, for a long time at NAVC, you had to travel between the Gaylord Hotel and the Marriott in order to get all of the lectures. And so people still lament that you don't have these spontaneous conversations that happen on a bus when you sit down next to a stranger for your 12 to 15-minute ride between the two venues. But Betty Morris of the Morris family sat down next to Rod Page, who was until about 3 or 4 years ago, he was also at Colorado State. He was Steve Withrow's successor at the Animal Cancer Center. And Rod and Betty said, well, what's really missing in our understanding of cancer? And Rod said, we don't have any big longitudinal studies following a large cohort of animals through their lives. And the advantage for anyone who's listening, and it's not obvious, is that you follow an animal all the way through its life. If you're documenting that life very carefully, then you get to the end, and some animals develop a disease, whether that's mitral valve disease or hemangiosarcoma of the spleen. And some of them have developed that, but then you also have a lot of them that didn't. And you can try to piece apart what's different about the lives, the genetics, the nutrition, the whatever of this group of animals that developed the disease. And so the Golden Retriever Lifetime Study was 3,000 Golden Retrievers in homes across North America. And every year, the owners would fill out a pretty deep questionnaire. I used to call it a 2 glass of wine questionnaire because it would take you that long. And about everything around that dog's lifestyle and what they ate, where they lived, how they lived, where they slept, how much exercise they got, etc. And then the dog would go to the veterinarian. The veterinarian would fill out a much smaller questionnaire because we knew what we were asking of them. But also we got biosamples from each of these dogs. So we got about 65 mils of blood. We had urine, feces, hair samples, nail samples, and of course the genetic swabs were done early in their lives. And so they have a huge biorepository of information, not just actual biological samples, but data samples as well. And so, yeah, ideally, it's going to be a fantastic resource for a bunch of studies and findings that happen as we go along. And yeah, we did pick Golden Retrievers primarily because we know that they're overrepresented with cancer. But also we had incredible support from the Golden Retriever Association of America. So the Golden Retriever Club. And so there were a lot of reasons. I also smile when people say, yeah, but how applicable are those to other breeds? When we talk about models, experimental models, I think Golden Retrievers are a reasonable model for dogs because they're dogs.
And it's helpful to have as many controls as possible. And so getting a single breed
Yes,
eliminates some of the confounding factors when
a
it
lot of them.
all of these things.
Yeah,
So
that's exactly right. I mean, most Golden Retrievers are kissing cousins of each other. And so by reducing that genetic variability, it actually helped us be able to piece apart things.
yeah. So what, for your perspective, like what is your favorite thing that you learned from this study?
Oh, well, I'm pretty biased. I had participant number 1199 was my
Oh,
dog, Bridger. And Bridger passed just last summer at a goodly age, almost 14. And, being able to participate in that and seeing I'll get to what the actual finding is that I get excited about. But there's right now a lot of confirmatory studies that happen. And I think sometimes we, as some might say, overeducated individuals, don't like confirmatory studies because we say, well, we obviously knew that. But I would make an argument that confirmatory studies are the foundation by which we build good new knowledge. And I think we will talk about Haberry a little bit later, but the point is you learn what you already know. And what we found was the main types of cancer, we actually have solid numbers. When I was going through training, we had pretend numbers. We think that Golden Retrievers get a lot of lymphoma, hemangiosarcoma, osteosarcoma, but we didn't have real numbers associated with that because all you could really do is find how many hemangiosarcomas and Golden Retrievers had presented to the Penn Vet small animal hospital and in their database, and then estimate how many is in that catchment area. And so then you estimate how many pets have gotten cancer from that. Now we have a real clear understanding. We have a denominator and a numerator, and so we know it. To me, right now, that's really where the value is coming out, is that we're getting very clear, very robust, and very well numerated confirmatory data examples. So what's a normal AST as the dog progresses? There are very few places in the world where you got every year the same group of animals getting full biochemical profiles. And some of those, I think some of the really exciting stuff is going to become how do we predict and prognosticate what's going to happen based on early indicators. And some of the stuff coming out of IDEX right now, some of the stuff coming out of Antech, very exciting when you start saying, okay, that's not out of normal range, but I'm seeing a trend and we probably need to think about being proactive, which gets into longevity research and the stuff that gets me really excited right now at this point in my career.
Exactly, and, if people listen to me enough, they know I have an interest in technology, and that's also where I think technology can accelerate some of our understanding is the ability to handle a lot of the data so far. Do you pr
Non-obvious associations, I think, is one of the true real values of AI. I think, because these are huge and complex data sets that we really don't understand. And someone's going to have to help us because our brains, we don't have the tools in here to be able to do it ourselves, but AI certainly can. It doesn't get distracted and tired like I do.
That is such a cool experience, and it led into the getting to a whole 'nother company where you could really start to dive even more into the genetics and cancer and things like that, becoming president of is it Vidium? Vidium?
Vidium, yeah. Mhm.
Yep, animal health. So, what was the story about getting that role, and what did you exactly do there? And you may have to break it down for me because I'm still trying to figure out exactly what it is.
I think that the ugly truth is so am I. But
Okay.
after I left Morris Animal Foundation, I was president of PetSmart Charities
Alright.
division. So I was a senior vice president at PetSmart, president of the Charities in the U.S. and in Canada. In Canada, PetSmart Charities is by and far the largest of the animal welfare charities. Amazing organization. So $15 million a year going to rescues and shelters in Canada, about $70 million a year going in the U.S. It is the power of the point of sale. I used to smile a lot, and that really this is about guilt. So you just bought a $15 toy for your dog who probably doesn't need another $15 toy. And someone reminds you that, oh, you could also give $1, $2, $5, $10 to help pets in need. And so 22% of people who use their credit card at PetSmart, in fact, give, and the average donation is $1.56. It was the best job that you can have. Very few people will ever come and yell at you as the head of that charity saying you didn't do what I wanted you to do, and not, because I gave you $1.56. So fantastic exposure to animal welfare. Again, it was another large organization that I got to navigate, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully, and got to really go deep and understand the animal welfare community as well as a retail organization. After about 4 years, I transitioned out of PetSmart Charities. I was done reporting to boards, and I was just going to be a consultant. Consulting seemed like it was a fun, easy thing for me to do. And one of my early consulting was building up a business plan for a brilliant professor at the Translational Genomics Research Institute in Phoenix, Will Hendricks, who has a real passion around the genomics of cancer. And so, to make it as straightforward as you can, cancer is a disease of the genes. So as mutations happen, it turns on or turns off genes that allow cells to become stupid and stop paying attention to the rules. And the biggest rule, of course, is you don't divide uncontrollably. And if you do divide a lot, you make sure that you're respecting every other organ in the body, every other cell in the body. And cancer cells just don't. They divide uncontrollably and they ignore the needs of the whole, which is ultimately how they kill us. Turns out we understand a lot, mainly through humans, and the fact that human genetics is very similar to canine genetics in many ways. So we can use that as a base of understanding of the genomics of cancer in dogs. And so what this company essentially did was took a piece of the tumor and sequenced it for 260 known cancer genes. And when we got that information, okay, this tumor, no matter what it is or what name we've put on it, this tumor has these mutations and therefore might be susceptible to this drug, which isn't approved for dogs because the markets are just never going to be big enough for those drugs to get approved for this narrow indication of HER2 positive mammary carcinoma. But in humans, it has been. And of course, thanks to the Animal Drug Use Clarification Act, we as veterinarians can use things off label. And so we would encourage and try to help educate veterinarians to use these drugs, which could be applicable and might see impact. And we saw tremendous success. There were a lot of cancers that looked like they were, you know, buy the small bag of dog food, don't buy the big bag of dog food kind of cases. And those animals are still with us because we had some really inquisitive, progressive veterinarians who wanted to give their patients the very best shot that they could.
You're fighting the devil, the evil.
Well, in that case, I think certainly with a great team of people, we might have been able to impact it at least in a few cases. That company was acquired by Anavive in at the end of 23.
You've done so much, so I'm running out of time, of course, to be able to ask you about everything I wish I could. So I want to ask 3 questions. They're probably going to be big. So
Okay, I'll try to be succinct.
The first one is, I did want to go back because, like you said, you've worked with PetSmart's Charities, which I think is a unique perspective of understanding pet need and how that's connected to human beings, but then also your work with Habri and understanding the human-animal bond. We had such a good conversation, and you pointed out something that was really unique about the relationship with pets, and you compared it even to human relationships with our children.
Right.
And how when we have pets, it's different because it's a promise that we are going to take care of them until basically forever and ever, until we death do us part. And with children, while we adore them and hope, yes, that we raise them in a way that they want to come back and visit sometimes, we are raising them to go off on their own where we are no longer responsible for them. So I would love for you to share a little bit about what you have learned and where you are today when it comes to the human-animal bond.
Sure. That's a big question. So we started the Human Animal Bond Research Institute in 2010, and there were 4 of us at the beginning. Bob Viteri from the American Pet Products Association, Charlie Piscatello from Petco, Mike McFarland, and me at Pfizer Animal Health. And Mike ended up being Global Chief Medical Officer for Zoetis, still one of my dearest friends. But he and I had to split the budget. I was in business development at the time. He was in operations. And we both exited that meeting saying, we've got budget this year. For anybody who's lived in large organizations, if you don't use all your budget, you don't generally get the same budget next year, which seems like a strange hamster wheel to be on, but it's still the game that you play. And I said, yep, great, but I don't want to be on the board. And he said, well, I don't want to be on the board. We're both too busy for this. And so we did the way all great decisions of life should be done, which is rock, paper, scissors. And Mike lost. And so Mike went onto the board, but then they conspired, I would say, against me and said, well, you're the only one here with a science background. You need to lead the research working group. And I have led that happily and proudly ever since. So we've done, I think there's about 60 studies that have been funded through Habri. It's a really unique organization, cross industry, where lots of different players, different types of companies have been associated with it and are sponsors of these studies. And really it comes down to the heart of our industry, which, all of us base our businesses on the human animal bond. And there's a lot that we already know about the human animal bond. It goes back to the confirmatory studies. So for instance, we've done a lot of work with therapy dogs in hospitals and how do those actually impact. And so one of my favorite studies is that it shows when you have in pediatric intensive care units, if there is a therapy dog present, it reduces the amount of sedation and pain control drugs which are administered to these patients. Again, you think, oh, yeah, that makes sense. But you didn't have any science behind it. You didn't have the data to be able to then go to the hospital administrators around the country and say, hey, look, this is a well-done study. We know we can help you if you allow for therapy dogs to be in these hospitals. So what have I learned around the human-animal bond? One is that perpetually pediatric relationship that we really have. We don't have good words for it in English, but I do think this is not like, they're not fur babies, or maybe they are eternal fur babies. They're always going to be babies, even though they're maybe senior pets. And then the second thing is, I think it's really important to recognize that the human-animal bond is actually very species dependent. The bond that I have had with cats who have shared my world with me is a very different bond than the bonds that I've had with dogs who've shared my world with me. And the same goes for people who have deep connections with their horses or with cattle, or for that matter, even with reptiles or with fish. I mean, I think that we need to respect those things. And I love the fact that we're having a renaissance of cat care right now, where people are really starting to understand that cats have been underappreciated from a commercial or product sense, as well as just underappreciated. The bond that we have with cats is so different, unique, but also extremely valuable. Or there's no lesser or greater than, it's just different. I love this concept of the human animal bond and the way that pets, animals have positioned themselves or been positioned in our society now, and also watching on a global scale and seeing how it's happening in different parts of the world. Just saw this really cool video about a dog beach and wolf stock that happened in Dubai. So, not exactly where you would say this is the heart of the human animal bond, but it was huge. There were thousands of dogs running around having a great time, and pet owners all getting to enjoy that experience together.
Yeah, we could do a whole podcast on that. I have a big heart for it as well. So, well, it kind
Okay,
of leads.
I'm in.
All right, we'll schedule that one. The second one, and that I guess that kind of goes into it because you've hinted at a few things, and that you come from such a cool perspective. I love at this time of year to really ask a lot of people, like, what are you seeing as the future of veterinary medicine, whether it's the next year, beyond? Like, what are
Totally.
you seeing?
So, I would say that the biggest thing that I'm seeing is the disintermediation of the veterinary profession. I don't know how I feel about it, because I will admit to mixed feelings, but I think that we may, as a profession, have allowed the human animal bond to outgrow us a little bit. I think people still love their veterinarians. And I think, honestly, given the opportunity, anybody would much rather get any pet advice from their veterinarian. I get phone calls from friends and family once a week about their pets. And so I think people would always choose to if they have the opportunity. I don't think many people have the opportunity. And one of the things that I've come to see, my most recent role was at a direct-to-consumer company, Embark Veterinary, where I led the science and business development teams. And that direct-to-consumer hammered home for me that people want to be the best pet parent that they can possibly be, no matter who they are, where their circumstances lie. I am not tremendously worried that pets are going to be relegated only to high-income people. I think the human animal bond is much stronger than that, and people will have pets in their lives if they can. I think that will they find veterinary care for them is a really important question. And I think as we go into 2026, I think we as a profession either need to put real concerted effort into how do we stay relevant, credible providers of information to most pet parents, or we need to watch the train pull out of the station, because the train's pulling out of the station regardless of whether we're on it or not. And I think that is both generational. I think it's also something to do with technology. I think that this is a real important time for our profession if we want to stay. If not, I mean, my optometrist, I don't have a deep relationship with them. When my children were little, I did have a fairly deep relationship with their pediatrician. So where do we want to go as a profession? Do we want to stay as pediatricians, where I think we have traditionally held that space? Or do we want to go to a place where, maybe we don't have that centrality, that center of gravity for pet parent universes? And maybe, somebody else will fill that need for them.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a big year to kind of make a decision and start acting upon it if we want to do something about it. So
Yeah, I mean, I think right now we as a profession are very inward focused. Whether it's labor issues or educational issues or mid-level practitioners, and I think those are all really important conversations to have. Make no mistake about it. But I think we are so focused on each other right now as a profession and our own health and how do we keep our house together. We're not really paying attention to the neighborhood, and the neighborhood is they're moving on. The pet parents they're going to find information somewhere. And, if it's medical information, I sure hope it's still veterinarians or veterinary-based resources, but I don't know.
Yeah. Ooh, leave that with a big fun bubble
Yeah,
over head at the end. No. Well, and so I always love to end on gratitude, though. So we always leave on a good note.
totally.
So when I say what's something you're really grateful for, what are the first things that come to your mind?
Oh, I am so grateful for the people in my life. And let me just backstep a second. I'm not really sure if that's a negative thing. This idea that veterinarians aren't the centrality point. I mean, I think there's a part of us that would like to stay central. Everyone wants to be central. But really, for the betterment of the 90 million dogs and 100 million cats that we have in North America alone, we're a small profession. We might not be able to meet all the needs that are there, and so maybe we shouldn't be so discouraged that there's a void that will eventually be filled. I'm a big believer in the free market, and so whether all of us are part of that or it's just not. So I am grateful for that as well. I think we have a lot of challenges as a society right now. I think that there are some trends that aren't positive, but I see so many positive trends, particularly when it comes to pets and the way people feel about pets in their lives. And so I've got a lot of gratitude about everything in my life. But I think for the purposes of this conversation, I've got a little 3-year-old golden retriever who's sleeping right next to me with her little lamb. So I'm pretty grateful for her too.
Oh,